Lecture 2, Setting the Stage, Problems in German Democracy and the Rise of the Nazis.
The inflation that we've been describing was brought under control in late 1923 and early 1924 in really dramatic fashion. I'm not going to take us through the actual steps of that, and I desperately hope that nobody will ask me about the economics behind the stabilization of the economy, except to say the following. In effect, the United States intervened. An international committee of financial experts was created to try and solve this problem, arising out of actually this question that was asked at the conclusion. A British and American dissatisfaction and concern that the inflation and the occupation of the ruhr were going to ruin the German economy, that the German economy would then ruin the European economy, the world economy, and so on. So there was a very strong interest in stabilizing the situation, bringing the mark under control. An international committee of financial experts was convened under the American Charles Dawes. They worked out an arrangement whereby the French would ultimately leave the ruhr. Germany would agree, A, to make a serious effort to pay reparations, and B, to put its economic house in order. And finally, one of the carrots held out by the financial experts, this committee of financial experts, was massive American loans to Germany. Again, not in the form of foreign aid, not directly from the Treasury, but that private funds from American banks would be funneled into Germany so that a massive influx of American capital would help to put Germany back on its feet again. As a consequence, the German government began in late 1923 and late November 23 and into the spring of 1924 set about putting its house in order. They did this in a number of different ways. First of all, there was no majority government in the Reichstag. It was impossible to find a working parliamentary majority. The government, therefore, took advantage of one of the clauses of the Weimar Constitution that we've not mentioned, and that was Article 48. Article 48 gave the government the authority to issue emergency decrees if the Republic were in grave danger, and if no parliamentary majority could be found. The government, therefore, would use Article 48 in late 1923 and early 1924 to pass what would have been highly controversial economic legislation to bring about the financial stabilization of the mark. Basically, in shorthand, a new currency was issued in October of 23, and a sharp restriction of credit also introduced. Interest rates quadrupled in a matter of 2 months. The government, in an effort to balance its budget, raised taxes dramatically. Those taxes falling particularly on real property and particularly on the farm community of Germany. So you get howls of protest coming from farmers who now suddenly discover that their tax rates have been increased threefold, as they point out, since 1913. And an anger of small shopkeepers. One of the things about inflation economies, I think one could argue that inflation is, in social terms, is a progressive policy. Money is spent, it's easy to borrow money, and so on. Between 1919 and 1923, one of the ways that the German government had ensured that returning veterans wouldn't be unemployed was this policy of inflation made it very easy to borrow money. They encouraged people to set up their own small shops so that you get a mushrooming of effect of small shops being established between 1919 and 1923. People borrowed money in this inflation economy. After the stabilization of the mark and the issuing of the new currency, and I think the rate was something like for so many trillion paper marks, you got a new mark. Suddenly people discovered that loans that they had taken out had to be paid back in real currency. So the restriction of credit, the new currency, angered small shopkeepers. It infuriated farmers, caused considerable dislocation. There were more bankruptcies in the first quarter of 1924 than there had been in the 4 years since the end of the war, as a lot of these small, marginal businesses failed with the stabilization. The government also moved to balance the budget. Raising taxes was one thing. One of the other major policies that the government introduced was what the Germans called the Beamtenabbau, the laying off of civil servants. Many returning veterans had been employed in the government between 1919 and 1924. The Reich government, with one fell swoop, between November, actually announced in November and would continue in a series of steps down to February of 24, laid off over 150,000 civil servants, many of whom had permanent tenure. And didn't give them 6 months' notice. They were simply laid off, benefits cut, and so on. And the Reich government encouraged state and local government to follow suit. They argued that the bureaucracy of Germany at every level was swollen as a result of the inflationary policy, and now one of the ways that the government was going to save was to lay off these civil servants. It is estimated that about 750,000 civil servants and public employees lost their jobs between November of 1923 and November of 1924. These people never, I think, forgave the Reich government for this dramatic action. They were angered, saw themselves as the truest of the true of the German population, and that the Weimar government had now sold them out. In addition, the government moved to revalorize the currency. The German Supreme Court in October of 1923, in a very controversial case, it argued that a mark equals a mark, and therefore this indicated a full revalorization of the value of one's savings set at around sometime in 1921. This, the German government felt, was absolutely impossible. And so in an emergency decree in February of 1924, the Reich government set the rate of revalorization at 15%. So that if you could show that you had a savings account or a trust fund or something at a value of X on a certain date in 1921 before the hyperinflation, you got 15% of the value of that back. Needless to say, this didn't make very many people happy at all. So that a great many people were angered by this tax decree in February of 1924. In fact, howls of protest from creditor organizations. At the same time, the government moved in early 1924 to encourage German business to employ new, what they called rationalized methods of production and administration. The mid-20s would see an attempt on the part of the Germans to pay reparations by being able to compete effectively in the international marketplace, to export. In order to do this, they felt they needed more streamlined methods at home. It would be the great age of the introduction of sort of conveyor, one associates with sort of conveyor belt technology in Germany. But it also was the introduction of a whole series of other things that we sort of take for granted. It is in the mid-20s, in the height of this rationalization movement, as it came to be known, that telephones begin to be widely introduced into German business, that adding machines are used, that typewriters become a major part of everyday business. The introduction of these machines would lead to the layoff of hundreds of thousands of white-collar employees, and particularly in the banking sector. Of course, after you probably don't need all these bank tellers and so on to deal with currency if you don't have these tons of bills floating around anymore. But certainly in the mid-20s, an era that is usually referred to as the golden 20s, you find high levels of unemployment among white-collar employees, particularly middle-aged men. Germany still functioned, of course, on the basis of the so-called social wage, which meant that men were obviously paid more than women. That goes without saying in the period for doing the same job. A married man was paid more than a single man. A married man with one child paid more. A married man with two children paid even more. One of the things the rationalization movement did was to lead to businesses firing these older male employees and replacing them with young women. who were paid very low salaries indeed. The result was that the stabilization of the mid-20s proved to be remarkably effective in an economic sense. By the end of 1924, the inflation had been brought under control. The German government had made major strides toward responsible fiscal policy. It was, in a sense, the Reagan-Thatcher stabilization of economies that took several years brought in Germany into a period of a matter of months. But what was effective economically proved to be highly destabilizing in a social sense, and I think in a political sense as well. The period from 1924 to 1928 is usually referred to as the Golden Twenties, die goldenen 20er Jahre, the sort of roaring 20s equivalent. A period of relative stability wedged very tenuously between the period of the hyperinflation on the one hand and, of course, the traumas of the Great Depression on the other. Nonetheless, if one looks at the mid-1920s, there are signs of instability and sources of potential trouble very clearly on the horizon. For one thing, the influx of American capital produced an apparent economic recovery. The Dawes Plan ushered in, as we've said, a period of foreign loans to Germany. The threats of a trade war, which had lingered around after the First World War, subsided, and Germany hoped to regain lost markets. However, the stability of the mid-20s, this period that is usually skipped over as historians talk about the Weimar Republic, that stability was an illusion, masking several very ominous trends. For one thing, the economic recovery of Germany in the mid-20s was very fragile. High unemployment, as we've indicated, subsisted through the so-called Golden Twenties. There was a high rate of bankruptcy that remained all the way through the mid-20s as those people who had made it through the inflation lost businesses in many cases during the stabilization. There were more bankruptcies declared in 1928 in Germany than there had been in the first quarter of 1924, which gives you some indication of the lingering impact of stabilization. And a serious agricultural recession had set in Germany in 1924, from which the agricultural sector in Germany never really recovered. By 1928, there was already an agricultural depression in Germany, preceding by a year the onset of the Great Depression. And all of these issues, like the revalorization issue, remained terribly divisive all the way through the mid-20s, which saw a tremendous growth of single-issue, special interest and regional parties, all of whom attacked the Weimar system for its failures. Failures in the inflation and failures in the stabilization. These parties appealed to different elements of the middle-class population of Germany and attacked the liberals and the conservatives for their failure to protect the small businessman, the small farmer, the little guy from the horrors of inflation and stabilization. By 1928, a year that is usually seen as the high watermark of Weimar stability and recovery, these single-issue special interest parties had more votes together than the two liberal parties in Germany and almost as many as the conservatives. At least a third of the middle-class electorate of Germany by 1928 had already left their traditional liberal and conservative homes and were looking for alternatives. And while these special interest parties tended to emphasize specific economic interests, they couched those interests within the context that was anti-big business, anti-big labor, anti-big government, which they saw as simply controlled as a sort of fraud, controlled by big business and big labor. They argued that Weimar parliamentary democracy was little more than a sham, and that the middle-class parties had failed them miserably. These sorts of parties, which individually were utterly insignificant, suggests that already before the Great Depression, this critique of the Weimar system was already in place and already, I think, possessed a considerable appeal to elements of the middle-class population. In addition to these political problems, the U.S. loans to Germany were primarily of a short-term variety and could be recalled at short notice. Germany also continued to have a negative balance of trade throughout the period. The national debt in Germany continued to rise, though it was papered over because of the massive influx of foreign capital. This has a familiar ring to it. I think it's with good reason. Germany, one of its most prominent political figures, Gustav Stresemann, a liberal politician, pointed out in this period, Germany, he said, was living on a volcano. If, and I quote, crisis ever hits us, Stresemann remarked in 1928, shortly before his premature death, if crisis ever hits us and the Americans recall their short-term loans, we face bankruptcy. Close quote. Indeed, Stresemann's worst fears would be borne out by developments in 1929-1930 when the Wall Street crash of 1929 would have direct, powerful reverberations in Germany. The German economy was very closely related to the American economy, so that Germany would be, and we'll have a chance to talk about this in more detail in a bit, Germany, along with the United States, would be the most directly affected economy by the Great Depression. During this period of the Golden Twenties, the NSDAP would reemerge from the catastrophe of the beer hall putsch. Hitler, as we've indicated, was sent off to prison, in Landsberg prison just outside of Augsburg, where he was in, I think, what we would call now, it was a minimum security prison. And indeed, if you've seen photographs of Hitler in prison, he's dressed in his lederhosen. He is surrounded by a sort of retinue of people. Rudolf Hess, his loyal secretary, accompanied him, and there was in, I wouldn't call it a cell, it's a very nice sort of pleasant room with the omnipresent geraniums. Hitler dictated his political biography, Mein Kampf, to Hess during his incarceration, laying out his political philosophy and talking about organization and tactics for the Nazi Party. The party, Hitler was released from prison in 1925, and the NSDAP was formally refounded in that year. This says something about the nature of the Weimar Republic, that, less than 18 months after a political party has attempted to overthrow the state, that the party is once again becomes a legal political entity, and that the leader of that party is released from prison. Hitler, during the period 1924 to 1930, was determined above all else to stand above ideological conflicts within the party. He was interested above all else in securing his recognition as the leader of the party. He now began to employ the term Führer of the party, leader of the party. Before his incarceration in Landsberg prison, he was often referred to by party members as der Chef, the chief. After this period of being in prison, Hitler would be slightly more distant and would attempt to create this sort of myth of the Führer, this distant Olympian sort of figure. He was interested in this period in reestablishing his authority over the party. He didn't really care about squabbles over ideological matters, of which there were many in this period, as long as both parties to any sort of internecine quarrel within the NSDAP recognized his ability in the end to make some sort of judgment. He was interested primarily in organizational reform. He drew certain lessons from the fiasco of the beer hall putsch. First, he drew the conclusion that a frontal assault on the Weimar Republic, no matter how weak and unstable that government was, would not succeed. The party needed to follow what he now called, quote, the path of legality to power. This meant to organize the party in such a way that it could recruit new members, and that membership would then be able to fill positions necessary to mount major electoral campaigns. The NSDAP, Hitler argued, now had to follow the path of legality to compete in parliamentary elections, not because, as he was perfectly frank about this, not because the NSDAP was now committed somehow to parliamentary government. On the contrary, we enter the parliament, Hitler stated on more than one occasion, in order to destroy it. If one reads through Mein Kampf, and I suspect we could get all the people who'd ever read that book into this room, The only sections of the book that show, let me rephrase that. Among those sections of the book that proved to be the most interesting were those dealing with organization and propaganda. Two areas where Hitler did have great talents. The emphasis of the party, he argued now, had to be on grassroots political mobilization, on recruitment of members, and then the mounting of major propaganda activities. In 1926, the party began to construct an elaborate network of propaganda cells around the country. The idea that Hitler had in mind for this was actually borrowed from the communists. That every local Ortsgruppe or Nazi party affiliate all over the country had to have a propaganda committee. The committee had to divide each community into different areas. Propaganda cells had to be created so that a chain of command, so that orders could move from party headquarters in Munich down through a chain of command to reach the grassroots level. These grassroots operatives were not only there to carry out orders from Munich, they were also supposed to function as kind of, I think, what we would see as grassroots political survey research teams to find out what people were what were people angry at, what didn't they like, what worked, what didn't. What did farmers care about? What did white-collar employees care about? What were civil servants unhappy about? What sort of posters looked good? Did people respond better to black posters with white lettering? What about red? These kinds of nitty-gritty details about propaganda activity were considered to be absolutely essential. This network of propaganda cells was then to extend across the country, allowing the NSDAP to develop a kind of circular flow of information where political intelligence would be gathered at the local level, passed up through the chain of command to the Munich headquarters, and then the Munich headquarters would send out propaganda directives, instructions, suggestions to all of these local affiliates about things, techniques, and so on that had been proven successful. The first opportunity for the NSDAP to use these techniques would come in the Reichstag elections of 1928. The party geared itself up for these elections. The police, the sort of German equivalent of the FBI that monitored radical political groups, was tremendously impressed by the activities and the organization of the party. But when the dust had settled from the 1928 elections, the Nazis had received a whopping 2.6% of the national vote. They had been unable to break out of the sort of lunatic fringes of German politics. They still remained an obscure sort of party. In the aftermath of those elections, a police official wrote a top-secret memorandum, and I'll sort of paraphrase it very closely, to police authorities in Berlin, in which he said, "This is a party that isn't going anywhere. It has, despite tremendous activity, despite good organization, it is a party that is unable to appeal to any significant portion of the German population and is unable to have any sort of impact on the contours of German political life," close quote. I've often wondered what happened to this particularly prescient police official having submitted that report in light of what was to come. But in some ways he was absolutely right. Despite the fact that the party had attempted to create this elaborate network of propaganda cells, it hadn't really worked. The party didn't have enough money. The financial condition of the party was quite bad. The party only had one national newspaper or two national newspapers and a handful of regional weekly papers. The lines of communication within the party were bad, and the membership of the party was minuscule. In other words, they had neither the money nor the manpower to make the kind of propaganda network that they had envisioned into a reality. At about this time, in 1927, in fact, a young man from northern Germany who had entered the party after the beer hall putsch had come forward and had already demonstrated considerable talents in propaganda. That man's name was Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels wrote a memorandum in 1927 in which he said, look, the propaganda cell idea is not a bad one at all. In fact, this is something we should continue to strive for. But let's face facts. We don't have the money to make this work. We don't have the men to make this work. What we need to do is to target carefully selected areas of the country where we know we can count on a certain amount of sympathy, and then to focus all of our attention for a week to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, in what he called a propaganda action. In that 2-week period, we'll bring in all of the big guns of the party. We will distribute millions of leaflets. We'll have all kinds of parades. We'll have all kinds of meetings. We'll have all kinds of public demonstrations. And in this way, we will have an impact. He realized that the party couldn't compete with the other major parties of Germany, but this way the party would be able to attract attention. And what was really significant, I think, about Goebbels' proposal was that these propaganda actions were to take place not in the context of an election campaign, but rather in the fallow periods in between elections when the other political parties had been demobilized. Now, most of the Weimar parties, particularly the bourgeois parties, tended to be like American parties. They evaporated between elections. The Nazis now began to talk about the possibility of what came to be known as perpetual campaigning. Campaigning in the times outside of the 6-week election campaigns. The second important development in Nazi propaganda coming out of the 1928 elections was that when the party looked at the election results carefully, they discovered something quite surprising. Up until 1928, the NSDAP had spent most of its time and energy trying to recruit in the major cities of Germany, believing, as Gregor Strasser, who was the second in command of the party, believing along with Strasser that the real potential pool of voters for the party was to be found in the working class of the cities. What they discovered in looking at the election results in 1928 is that the party had done abysmally in the cities, hadn't done very well apparently with workers at all, but that the party had done surprisingly well in small towns and in rural areas, particularly in northern Germany, Protestant Germany. As a consequence, after the election, the party drew 2 conclusions. One, to embark upon the sort of propaganda actions that Goebbels had described in his 1927 memorandum. And second, to really begin to concentrate now on cultivating a middle-class, small-town, rural constituency. That here, the party had some real possibility to expand. The problem was that the NSDAP needed an issue. It needed something. It was all well and good to have these organizational insights and ambitions, but the party needed something that would catapult it into the mainstream of German political consciousness. And in 1928, it did not have that issue, and none was on the horizon, except, of course, in the agrarian population where, as you'll recall, an agricultural recession had already deepened into a depression. The issues that the Nazis needed, of course, would be provided by the Great Depression, which would hit Germany with tremendous fury in the late fall and early winter of 1929-1930. It had already begun, as we've seen, in the agricultural community, but would be tremendously important in urban Germany as well in 1929 and early 1930. The NSDAP would cash in on the Great Crash in 1929-1930, would make the Great Depression into its issues. To give you some sense of what the Depression meant for Germany, let me reel off a number of statistics that will give you some, I think, glimpse of the profound impact of the Depression on the German economy. Between 1928 and 1930, industrial production in Germany dropped by 31%. Unemployment catapulted by 200% over 1928 levels, particularly to be found in blue-collar and among blue-collar workers in the industrial sector of the economy. The government deficit mushroomed because Germany had a very generous unemployment insurance package. Bankruptcy skyrocketed, especially among small businesses, and foreclosures of farms became an everyday occurrence. The sort of story that we were seeing in the United States in the early Reagan administration of small family farmers committing suicide after having lost the family farm, or bankers going to foreclose on a farm being shot. These things occurred with frightening regularity in rural Germany in 1928, 29, and into 1930. The coalition government, which had been established in Germany in 1928 which consisted of the Social Democrats, the Liberal parties, and the Catholic Center, collapsed in March of 1930 as the Social Democrats and their Liberal coalition partners disagreed on the best way to deal with unemployment. The inability of the government to reach some sort of conclusion would lead to the calling of Heinrich Brüning, a Catholic Center politician, to the position of Reich Chancellor in the spring of 1930. And Brüning, realizing that no majority government was possible, would fall back on the use of Article 48, emergency decree. Brüning believed, following the economic wisdom of the day, the orthodox economic wisdom of the day, that the way to get out of the Depression was to balance the budget, to reduce government expenditures, to drive down prices and wages, not to prime the pump. The idea of deficit spending was alien, certainly to Brüning and to virtually all the other Weimar parties in this period. Only the Nazis would advocate spending one's way out of the Depression. The Brüning cabinet, therefore, would use Article 48 to introduce a number of profoundly unpopular economic measures to deal with the Depression. Emergency decrees which did indeed drive down wages and other benefits, retirement benefits for civil servants and so on. The middle-class parties in this situation were tremendously divided, not knowing which way was the proper way out of the Depression, whether they should support the Brüning government or resist. And the upshot was that when Brüning decided in the summer of 1930 to dissolve the Reichstag and call for new elections, the conservative and liberal parties were in absolute disarray. They were not prepared for an election campaign. Most of them had been discredited because of their participation in the Weimar government down to this point, and therefore faced a very unpleasant task in confronting the German electorate. The NSDAP, on the other hand, found itself ready and willing, indeed chomping at the bit, to conduct the campaign. The NSDAP's campaign machine was ready. It was run for the first time by Joseph Goebbels, who assumed control of Nazi propaganda in early 1930. He had centralized control over the party's propaganda operations. Membership had been rising steadily in the party since 1928. And the party had achieved some surprising successes in regional elections in 29 and early 1930. The NSDAP would use their network of propaganda cells as well as this propaganda action of Goebbels to conduct the most aggressive political campaign Germany had ever seen. Using modern techniques of propaganda, the NSDAP targeted constituencies. They went after the farmers. They went after small shopkeepers. They went after civil servants afraid of layoffs. The Nazis became masters of something that we would call negative campaigning. The Nazis discovered quite early on in the campaign, and Goebbels wrote about this extensively, that offering a positive alternative to the Weimar Republic wasn't necessary in any sort of detail, that all one had to do was to hammer away at the failures of what the Nazis now referred to as the Weimar system. It was much easier in 1930, and one can say this for 1931 and 1932, when the Nazis become the largest political party in Germany. It was much easier to tell what the Nazis were opposed to than what the Nazis stood for. They were opposed to big business. They were opposed to big labor. They were opposed to the failures of the Weimar system. They were anti-Versailles. They were anti-Semitic, and so on. Indeed, in a very famous interview with Gregor Strasser, the second in command of the party, a journalist. Now, this interview came in 1932, but it's apropos of 1930 as well. Strasser was asked by this frustrated journalist, Herr Strasser, we have some sense about what the Nazis don't like in German society, about what you don't like. But what do you stand for? Strasser didn't miss a beat. He didn't turn a hair. He didn't hesitate. He simply said, the National Socialist German Workers' Party stands for the opposite of what exists today. Now, it isn't that the Nazis didn't have specific programs. They did. They had them for, you could find a Nazi program to tell you what their position on fertilizer for German farmers. They had plans about how to get out of the Depression. Nobody read either one of them. What the NSDAP concentrated on throughout its campaign in 1930 was the failure of the Weimar system. Here is a system, they argued, that has provided us with what? What has it given us? It gave us a loss in the First World War. It gave us the Treaty of Versailles. It gave us the worst inflation in the history of man. It gave us a harsh stabilization in the mid-1920s. And now it has provided us with a coup de grace. It has provided us with the Great Depression, with unprecedented rates of unemployment and no end in sight. And, they argued, this was the policy of first the Social Democrats, then the Liberals, then the Conservatives. What party hadn't failed, they argued? Only the NSDAP. The NSDAP had a great advantage in this, of course, as all people who engage in negative campaigning have. The NSDAP had never been in power. It was the only party, aside from these single issue and special interest parties, that had not shared government responsibility at one point or another. There was one other party that hadn't, of course, and that was the Communists. So from the radical left and the radical right. The NSDAP carried out an extraordinarily vigorous, aggressive campaign marked by violence. The Nazi SA, the stormtroopers, these jackbooted, brown-shirted men who had been recruited primarily to defend Nazi speakers at rallies, but had now become the sort of literally the storm troops of the party in the street, taking up collections, protecting Nazi speakers, and harassing opposing politicians, particularly on the left. Violence between Nazis and communists in the streets would make its appearance in the 1930 election and would become a hallmark of German elections in 1932. When the election results were counted on the evening of September 14th, 1930, nobody was prepared for the outcome. The NSDAP had moved from having a party of a few 100,000 supporters to become the second largest political party in Germany. In 1928, it had received 2.6% of the vote. In 1930, it was 18.3% of the vote. Only the Social Democrats, with 24% of the vote, were larger than the National Socialist Party. Who were these people that had flocked to the NSDAP suddenly in 1930? Well, one didn't have to be an electoral specialist to recognize that the NSDAP had done extremely well in northern Germany, Protestant Germany, and had not done particularly well in the Catholic sections of Germany. In Bavaria, for example, the area one usually associates with National Socialism, the party had not done very well at all. The party had done very well in rural areas, the small towns and agrarian areas of northern Germany, and that the party had not done very well in the working class inner cities of the industrial heartland of Germany. The aftermath of the 1930 election left party politicians and political pundits at a loss. The election results had a staggering impact on the already embattled Weimar Republic. The success of the NSDAP and the rising vote of the communists as well had made a return to any kind of parliamentary majority coalition almost impossible. Brüning wasn't willing to make a deal with the Nazis in 1930, and he certainly didn't want to have the communists in his government, nor was he terribly interested in bringing the Social Democrats into the government. The Social Democrats, who still controlled the largest state in Germany, Prussia, 3/5 of Germany, were prepared to tolerate, as they put it, the Brüning government, but not to enter the Brüning government. That is, they wouldn't bring it down by a vote of no confidence in the Reichstag. Brüning opted now for an increasing use of Article 48 of emergency decree. What Brüning had in mind was forcing the German public to drink the bitter medicine that he believed necessary to get Germany out of the Depression, and that the only way to get the public to accept this was by emergency decree. As a consequence, in 1930, Brüning would issue 5 emergency decrees. In 1931, 40 emergency decrees. In 1932, in fact, by the middle of 1932, when Brüning left office, 57 emergency decrees had been issued. Rule by emergency decree had become the norm for government in Germany. This is extremely important because it habituated the German public to accept the idea that Parliament was ineffectual and to accept these kinds of draconian measures coming from a government. This would be extremely important in 1933, when the people who were issuing emergency decrees were not Brüning and the Catholic Center Party or the Social Democrats, but rather the NSDAP and Adolf Hitler. Almost 3 years before Hitler assumed the reins of power, in other words, Brüning had embarked upon a course that would lead to the end of parliamentary government in Germany. The recourse to emergency decree was necessary because Brüning wanted to introduce measures that he knew would be profoundly unpopular. Between September of 1930 and the summer of 1932, here again comes a litany of bad economic news, industrial production plunged by 50%, the most stunning drop coming in 1931. Unemployment skyrocketed. Over 6 million people were unemployed in the summer of 1932. It's estimated that about another 2 million had simply stopped looking for work, had vanished from the unemployment rolls and vanished from the statistics. Every German city had a shanty town around it as people lived in their equivalent of cardboard boxes. Roughly 1/3 of the German workforce was either unemployed or working on extremely reduced hours by the summer of 1932. Bankruptcies continued their upward climb, especially in small and marginal businesses, and especially among small farms. In 1931, a banking crisis hit Germany, similar to that hit the United States in roughly the same period. And government deficits grew as the Reich government tried to cope with unemployment and to pay unemployment benefits. But Brüning was still afraid of things like public works programs. This was something he didn't want to try. This is where the real lessons of the inflation come in. The German government was so terrified of a return to hyperinflation that all the way through the Depression, it trod very, very gingerly in these matters. Using emergency decrees then, Brüning reduced wages, reduced prices, reduced pensions and other social services, while raising taxes on certain items and introducing new ones. This is not, as you can see, a formula for political popularity. And indeed, these emergency decrees failed to halt the disastrous slide of the German economy. But they certainly did inflame political passions to a fever pitch, producing a new severe crisis of the system, as it was now universally called. The Nazis, of course, thrived in precisely this sort of environment. They exploited this growing mood of pessimism and resentment, and the party's increasingly sophisticated propaganda apparatus functioned with ever greater efficiency. There were no elections, no national elections in 1931, but the party's revolutionary strategy of perpetual campaigning now really began to pay dividends. The party just continued to campaign, whether or not there was an election going on or not, so that the Nazis become a kind of ubiquitous presence all over the country. The one party that you could be sure would be represented in every small village to every major city. Its propaganda activities also raised considerable revenue. The propaganda activities of the party were extremely important here because they paid for themselves. NSDAP's propaganda was a profit-making proposition. But I think before we proceed to talk about these things in any detail, I really want to talk about the nature of Nazi campaigning and mobilization in 1932.